Welcome to the Real Food Mental Health Podcast, where we explore the powerful connection between mental and physical health. My name is Cody Cox, a holistic nutritional psychotherapist, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to true wellness, mind, body, and spirit. If you're tired of quick fixes and want real solutions that address the root cause, you're in the right place. Let's get started on your path to lasting wellness. Hey, welcome back. My name is Cody Cox. I'm your host, and you're listening to Real Food Mental Health. When I applied to graduate school, I had totally the wrong idea of what it meant to be a therapist. Now, I still had the earnest desire to help other people, and so I just went ahead and just went through it anyway. But I thought I'd record this bonus episode because I've had a lot of people, probably 25% or more of the people who come to therapy, at least to see me, have a desire to become a therapist themselves. And I just wanted to give everybody a heads up on what therapy actually is. It's not just the stereotypical therapist of sitting in a chair with a clipboard, wearing a sweater vest, and talking to somebody about their dreams as they lie in a chaise lounge. That is a very stereotypical view, which we can thank Sigmund Freud for that one. And it's an antiquated idea. I think it was more of a thing several decades ago, but that is not how it is today. So today's episode is all about what is it really like to be a therapist? And what to expect, ethical considerations, legal considerations, things that I honestly really didn't like about going to graduate school and becoming a therapist, and things that I actually do like about being a therapist. So the first thing is stereotypes. So I already mentioned the stereotype of the clinician sitting with a clipboard talking about dreams. But then another one is the therapist is assumed to ask, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? Now, that is not all wrong. We do ask open-ended, thought-provoking questions, and we do talk a lot about feelings. And so sometimes it might include, how do you feel about that? But hopefully it also includes asking a whole lot of other questions besides just that one. We often assume that a therapist has back-to-back appointments all week long, and all they do is kick back with somebody in a living room type setting and just talk about life. That's not really what it's like to be a therapist. We assume that therapists only do appointments. So we don't have back-to-back appointments all week long, and we don't only do appointments. So here's the reality of it all. Most therapists have an office that looks like a living room, but no chaise lounge. We try our best to make it a comfortable situation. So, we don't want you to feel like you're in an examination room. We want you to feel comfortable. So we usually have a love seat or a couch. The therapist sits in an armchair or an accent chair of some kind. And we do sit and talk, but it's a lot more structured and it's a lot more clinically informed than simply talking about life. Sometimes we take notes. We don't always have a clipboard. Usually, if we're taking notes, it's on a laptop. Sometimes it's a small notebook. And in many cases, we don't take notes at all during the session. But I mentioned we don't only do appointments. And so one thing that all therapists have to do, regardless of the setting that we work in, is we have to take case notes. What does that mean? Well, after you leave, typically we have to write about what it is that we talked about in a therapy session. This is true especially if we're billing insurance, because they require it as proof of medical necessity. But also it's true if we're not billing insurance too, because it's just considered best practice for therapists. So we're at least writing case notes. We don't have back-to-back appointments because we don't always have a full schedule, for one thing, but we also have trainings and staff meetings and supervision hours, especially for those who are newer therapists. Sometimes we're dealing with billing issues with like insurance companies or sending invoices to clients directly or responding to emails, people asking questions about therapy or asking questions about billing. We're making phone calls, especially coordinating with parents or other practitioners, or simply calling people back who are asking to get scheduled. If we are self employed, we might be dealing with social media, writing books and blogs, business networking, accounting, marketing, and in my case, podcasting. That's actually not a very common thing for therapists to do, but some of us do it. So, I thought I'd go over the training that's involved in becoming a therapist because I was very disappointed in graduate school. The number one thing that I was the most disappointed with was that they didn't warn me that men really struggle in this profession. I was one of few men in my entire program of 200 plus students. Not once in the full 2.5 years did anybody say, oh, by the way, prepare yourself because men really have a hard time being a therapist, financially speaking. Emotionally speaking, that's a different thing. But financially speaking, men really struggle in the mental health profession unless they get a PhD and become a professor, or they get an MD and become a psychiatrist. I would say those are the only two situations in which men actually do pretty well in this profession, financially speaking. Now, there is this stereotype that women are more compassionate and therefore make better therapists. And that's actually why men don't do well in this profession, because most clients who are looking for therapy want a female therapist, just out of stereotype. And it's really unfair for those of us who are male therapists because nobody goes into this profession out of greed. I think we all go into it knowing very well that we're not going to make very much money. And so, why do we go into this profession? It's because we want to make a difference in the world. We truly want to help people. So, because of that, male therapists are compassionate too. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a therapist. So, if you are looking for therapy, don't discount the qualifications or um, the ability of a male therapist to be a good therapist for you. Most likely, if they're a therapist at all, they are compassionate by nature. Now, that was the number one thing that really disappointed me about graduate school. They didn't warn me of that. Another thing that really disappointed me was I had to take a lot of classes that were just flat out superfluous to my career goals. Now, I kind of get it because they were really just kind of catering to what most states require for licensure. But for example, I had to take a chemical dependence class. I have had no intention of becoming a substance abuse counselor. I've done it a little bit, but I really hate doing that. It was just never something that appealed to me. I had to take that class anyway, it was just required. Another one was like child therapy. Again, I had no intention of becoming a child therapist, but it was just a required class that I had to take. A research class, a statistics class. These are just things that honestly, it's just academic bias. I had to memorize concepts that simply don't translate to the real world. And I think honestly, you're going to find that in any profession, as long as it requires a university degree. Any university degree is going to have a very strong academic bias where you have to study things that really only make sense in a university setting, like conducting research. You're not likely to conduct research in a clinical setting, but in a university setting that makes more sense. So universities are very, very biased toward their own academic principles. So they think they have to teach you the academic principles and they think it's relevant to the real world of being a professional, but it's not unless you become a professor at a university. So that was another thing. Granted, I did sign up for a Master of Science program rather than a Master of Arts program. So I should have known better. A Master of Science is going to be more focused on science and research, where a Master of Arts is going to be more focused on the practical application. So if you don't like doing research, maybe sign up for a Master of Arts program rather than a Master of Science program. But if you don't mind the idea of doing a bunch of research and doing a thesis, a Master of Science might be the right route for you. Now, the good news is if you have at least a Master of Science degree, you might even be able to teach at a university. So at least I can say that. I've never taught at a university, but I have the credentials that I could teach at a university. Many of the bigger universities require a PhD, but there are some smaller universities that will take somebody with a Master of Science, especially if you have a lot of clinical experience too to go along with that degree. You have to take exams. So sadly, even though I did a Master of Science program, I wrote a lot of papers, I still had to take one exam at the very end of my program to quote unquote prove competency. And I put that in quotes because to me, I look back at my school experience and I'm like, taking an exam really doesn't prove that I know anything. The only thing it proves is that I know how to take an exam. So, for example, like going back to that academic bias of the curriculum, exams really are very biased in the way that they're written. So, I took a business law class many years ago, but I took that class and it was taught by a judge. And I think he let it get to his head that he was both a judge and a professor. And he made his open book quizzes very, very difficult. I remember I had the textbook sitting in front of me. I found the paragraph where the answer was in the textbook, and all the wording matched up on the quizzes and the exams, but I could not figure out what the answer was because the way that he wrote the multiple choice answers, they were all basically the same, but with slightly different wording. And I could not figure it out, even though I was looking at the answer in the textbook. So there's a whole lot of bias, even just in the way that they write the exams. But another thing is they test you on things that you don't really need to know in the real world. So looking back on my experience, I took and I passed all of my exams on the first attempt. Typically in graduate school, you only have one attempt, but when you take your licensure exams, you have a few attempts. You have to spend hundreds of dollars every time you take those exams, but you do have a few attempts to finally pass them. And I'm grateful that I passed them all on the first attempt so I could just move on with my life because a lot of the content in these exams were just purely academic jargon and bias and even some politically oriented stuff in there that you just don't really need to know to be a good therapist. But I had to take it anyway. So, as far as the content goes, for example, a lot of it is testing you on counseling theories that you never intend to use as an actual therapist. It tests you on the history of psychotherapy that you never actually intend to use as an actual psychotherapist. It tests you on research methods. It tests you on statistics, statistical concepts. It tests you on all kinds of things that you really will never use unless you get a PhD and you teach other therapists this very same stuff. So naturally, I took these exams, and as soon as I passed, I moved on with life and I forgot all of that material because I didn't truly become a therapist until after I finished graduate school. And I think that's the case for most of us. You're not really a therapist until you've been practicing therapy for a while first. You need that real world experience. So the degree is not everything. Sometimes people will go through graduate school and they graduate, but they never become a licensed therapist. And so they can say that they got the training, but they can't ever say that they were a therapist because they never had that real world experience or that license that that's required to get that real world experience. Now, I said men don't financially do well in the profession, but I just wanted to mention most therapists don't make a lot of money. I have mentioned in previous episodes that there's this false assumption that we make a lot of money because we charge $100+ per session, and people assume that we make that as our hourly pay, but that is not true. We only make a percentage of that, and we don't have back-to-back appointments. We do other things between appointments that we don't get paid for, so that actually lessens our hourly pay overall. There is a very strong political bias in graduate school that you're going to have to deal with in most graduate programs in psychology, regardless of which program you're doing. As long as it's a psychology based program to become a therapist, you're going to have a very liberal bias that you're going to run into. And I've heard that that's the case even at Christian universities to some degree, although to a lesser degree. You are going to run into a very strong political bias. And so if you are like me, you're a heterosexual white male, or maybe even a heterosexual white female, that might really bother you when you go into a liberal program that is essentially demonizing heterosexual whites in general. And you're probably not going to be very happy about that. That actually personally very much traumatized me when I was a graduate student. And I think in some ways I'm still trying to get over that. But just a heads up on that, it is a very politically biased profession, and it can be traumatizing depending on your your political or religious background. You do not need a doctorate degree to become a therapist. Most therapists actually have master's degrees, which is still very high level training. It's not easy to get a master's degree and to become a therapist. A doctorate degree is really just required if you want to either prescribe medication, so that would be a psychiatrist, or if you want to be a professor at a very large university, that would require a PhD. You will have to do internships, so if you want to go to graduate school to become a therapist, be thinking of where you might want to be an intern. That is a requirement for all graduate level programs. You have to do for me, it was 600 hours of internships before I could even graduate. So I ended up working at 3 different places so I could meet all of those hours because it was hard. But be thinking about where you want to work. There are several different practice settings that you could work in as a therapist. Most therapists work in a private practice setting. Unfortunately, most therapists don't understand what a private practice setting actually is. Even seasoned therapists talk about private practice as if you must be self employed to be in private practice, but that is not the case. A private practice is really just a practice that is privately funded, either through the patient just giving you cash for your services or through private insurance companies, as opposed to a public practice, which would be like a community mental health clinic where you're taking Medicaid or Medicare, or a nonprofit organization where the funding is coming from grants. That would be more like a public practice setting. So a private practice setting is anything that's privately owned and it is being funded from private sources. This is where most therapists work. There are 2 different kinds of private practices. So there's a solo practice and there's a group practice. Now, in both of these types of private practices, often the therapists do not take a lunch break because you get paid according to the number of sessions that you have in a given pay period. And so, because of that, therapists don't want to just sit and take a lunch break and be wasting time that they could otherwise be getting paid for. And so, from my experience, I've worked in 3 private practice settings in my career. All group, well, actually 4. 3 of them have been group practices. One of them is a solo practice that I currently own. And let me tell you, in the group practices that I've worked in, I have watched other therapists just snack on candy between sessions or other unhealthy snacks because usually in group practices, They have baskets of candy or other snacks in the break room that therapists can snack on throughout the day. And that's all therapists will eat for the entire day. They do not eat a healthy lunch. Now, once in a while, especially if it's a group practice, they will offer a lunch meeting once in a while. Sometimes they'll offer like a catered lunch that they'll bring to the office, but pretty much 100% of the time, it's not healthy food. So it sounds great to get a free lunch, but if you are listening to my podcast, chances are you care about healthy food. And so that's not really the best perk of working in a group practice. Now, a solo practice, I'll get more to the group practice stuff in a little bit, but a solo practice is a very common form of a private practice. This is where the therapist works alone and has their own office that they don't share unless they sublease it to or from another therapist. So I think most therapists are introverts, and we really appreciate having our own private office where we can leave our personal belongings overnight or over the weekend and not worry about other therapists or other people coming in and disturbing our personal things. I think we appreciate having that privacy. So, a solo practitioner, a therapist working in a solo practice, is the one who is going to get that a private office that remains undisturbed. But working in a solo practice isn't all easy. It actually requires a lot more administrative work than any other type of practice setting. That includes marketing, social media, accounting and finances, writing content for books and blogs. I've mentioned a few of these before. Networking with other professionals, including other healthcare providers. Sometimes podcasting, that's actually kind of a rare thing, but I'm a podcaster, and I know there are a few other therapists in my area who have podcasts. But quite honestly, podcasting is so time consuming, most therapists just don't want to deal with it. The only reason I'm doing podcasting is because it's kind of an effort of marketing for me, but then also I want to offer free information to people who can't afford therapy or who are in need of more holistic concepts that they're not getting from their current therapist. So I hope that this podcast has been beneficial to you in that way as a listener. Now, in a private practice setting, as a solo practitioner, this is where you're most likely to have to take a couple of courses since they don't teach business skills in graduate school for therapists. And that is another gripe that I have against graduate schools. Most therapists have the desire to be in private practice, to be self employed, and to work basically alone or maybe in a group setting. But we want to work in a private practice setting. But my graduate school program, they didn't talk at all about private practices, and they didn't talk at all about having business skills. Like how do you market yourself as a therapist? How do you get clients? How do you get your name out there and let people know that you have availability on your schedule? They don't teach you any of that in graduate school. So you most likely will have to take some courses, read some books. In extreme circumstances, you might even get another degree in business. And so heads up on that. If you want to work in a private practice setting, you might need some business skills. If you are self-employed, you have to start as a solo therapist unless you are qualified to be a supervisor. Then you can jump straight to hiring supervisees. Now, to be qualified as a supervisor, it depends on the state that you're in, but in most cases, you need at least 2 years of experience and still be in good standing with your state after you are independently licensed. So those 2 years do not count while you are still being supervised. Typically, you still have to work under supervision for at least a couple of years after you finish graduate school. So you're doing your internship or sometimes they call it a practicum during graduate school. That's before you graduate. For me, that was 600 hours. And then after graduate school, you have to get, it depends on the state. For me, it was 4,000 hours. I got more like 8,000 hours before I became independently licensed. But you have to get at least a couple of years of full-time experience under supervision before you can become independently licensed. And then at that point, that's when your clock starts, where you still have to get 2 more years of experience before you can become a qualified supervisor. In some states, they require you to get supervisor training in addition to all that experience. So it just depends on the state, but in most cases, you still have to get the 2 years after independent licensure. Now, a group practice. Group practice owners are usually more experienced because they are qualified supervisors. So they have at least 4 years of experience after graduation. But typically, when somebody starts a group practice, I'd hate to say it, but it's out of greed most of the time. They're looking to make more money because they're dissatisfied with how little that they've been making all these years as a therapist so far. And so, from a business standpoint, that makes perfect sense. I can totally understand why a group practice owner would expand their practice into a group practice. Because if you think about it, if you hire clinicians to see clients for you and you only pay them like 40% of the income and you take the other 60%, yes, you have overhead costs. You have to pay taxes, you have to pay for the office, you have to pay for advertising. But most of the time, the group practice owner gets a cut of that too. So, most often, a group practice owner will start a group practice mostly just to make some more money so that they can provide for their family better. I don't want to frame them in such a negative light. It's not purely out of greed. Sometimes it is out of necessity because they need more money to provide for their wife and their children or their husband or whoever. Sometimes they have a legitimate need for more money, but usually it is out of a desire to make more money. Group practices are limited to just a handful of supervisors. Usually it's just one or two supervisors, depending on how big the group practice is, because most clinicians who are qualified to be supervisors would rather not be at a group practice. They would rather be a solo practitioner where they can be self-employed and they can pay themselves more. Again, from a business standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. Once in a while at a group practice, though, you will find a few seasoned clinicians who they're just like, they just want to be a therapist. They don't want to do the business stuff. So sometimes you will run into that. But I think most of us who are well experienced would rather be self employed because we have more autonomy, we can make more money, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing that's limiting to group practices is supervisors are limited to just a handful of supervisees. It depends on the state that you're in, but in my state, I believe we can only supervise up to 6 interns or supervisees at a time. So legally, it is capped at 6, which means we can't hire any more supervised clinicians other than just 6 unless we are able to hire a qualified supervisor who is willing to supervise more employees. So, most of the time, because therapists would rather be self employed, there is a high turnover in a group practice because as soon as a therapist no longer needs to be supervised, typically they quit because they want to start their own private practice. That makes perfect sense. I did the same thing. I've known a lot of other therapists who have done the same thing. So if you are a person who maybe you are a therapist already, maybe you're in graduate school, or you have the desire of going to graduate school for therapy, if you ever want to start a group practice, keep that in mind. You're probably not going to keep employees for very long because most employees would rather be self-employed. And so they will leave you as soon as they legally can be practicing independently. A drawback to group practices is that they will throw you anybody and everybody for your clients, not necessarily the ideal clients that you want to see. That has always been a major drawback for me. I've worked in 3 different group practice settings, and in every single situation, I have been given clients that I didn't necessarily want to see, just because group practices usually market themselves as just a general mental health clinic. And so they will literally just take anybody and everybody who just wants any kind of therapy. They don't really have any specific niche. So, along those lines, group practices will not market your niche or special training. And that was a major sore spot for me because I knew that I wanted to specialize in nutrition for mental health. But none of the practices that I've worked at have ever actually marketed my niche for me. Nobody ever really says, "Oh yeah, Cody, he is such a special therapist because he has this training that no other therapist has." None of my employers have ever really marketed me that way, and I've always been disappointed with that. Because of that, I've ended up with clients who aren't even interested in nutrition or holistic psychotherapy. They just want therapy in general because they're mentally ill. And so, the thing with not getting the clients that you want to see is it leads to a higher rate of burnout. Burnout is a real thing, and every therapist deals with it. In fact, every helping professional deals with it. So teachers, that's another one. Doctors, that's another one. Pretty much any healthcare provider or education professional is going to deal with burnout. Burnout is essentially that you have such as a desire to help people. You are working so hard to do such a good job, but you're just getting so exhausted that you can't even take care of yourself. So I mentioned, often in private practice settings, especially group practices, they'll have candy in the break room. Therapists don't often eat lunch, so they're not really taking care of themselves. But honestly, as a nutritionist, I could say that if they're eating candy all day between sessions, that is exacerbating their burnout because they're causing themselves adrenal fatigue, insulin resistance, a whole host of problems. So, if you want to avoid burnout, I would highly recommend eating a low carb, whole food diet. Biologically speaking, that'll help you a lot, but then also just general self care, keeping your stress down, exercising, sleeping well, doing all those things too. Working in a group practice is easier since you don't have to do any business stuff. It is usually just appointments, case notes, and staff meetings. Sometimes you have to do billing if there's not somebody on staff to do the billing for you. I actually did have to do billing at one of the group practices that I worked at. I didn't directly have to deal with insurance. We had a part-time person who was kind of helping with the insurance side of things, but I did have to take money and I did have to issue receipts and I did have to input people's insurance information in our HIPAA compliant system. So I had to set people up and I did have to take money, but as far as processing insurance claims, most of the time there's somebody else to do that for you. But if you become a therapist and work in a group practice, you might have to learn to do that yourself. If you are a solo practitioner, you're more likely to have to do that yourself if you take insurance. I'm going to get to some ethical considerations in a minute, but just to finish off with group practices, they might also sometimes have a dietitian or a nurse practitioner on staff. If that's the case, you're not working at a holistic practice. You're working at an integrative practice, which I think is still better than not integrative or holistic, but it's still not holistic, which makes it, in my opinion, an inferior practice. Quite often, they hire dietitians or nurse practitioners because, for one thing, they want the nurse practitioner to prescribe medication so they can do that all in house without having to refer clients elsewhere. And they want a dietitian because I think sometimes the practice owners are starting to realize that diet actually plays a huge role in mental health. But the problem is they're hiring the wrong kind of clinician. They're hiring somebody who is conventionally trained and uh, quite honestly, they have a degree and they are qualified to talk about diet, but they are not qualified to teach people to use food as medicine. And there is a big difference between a dietitian and a certified nutritionist, and that's the main difference. Dietitians don't see food as medicine, where a nutritionist will see food as medicine. And so again, if you're working at a place that has a dietitian or a nurse practitioner, it's not a holistic practice, if that's something that matters to you. So, in a private practice setting, especially if you're self employed, you will have more autonomy for making ethical decisions. So, that's a really good thing. So, when you work like in a salaried position at a university or a public mental health clinic or a hospital, quite often you've got a lot of very strict policies that you have to adhere to. But when you're in private practice, especially when you're self employed, you get to make those policies. Obviously, you still have to follow the law, you still have to be ethical in what you do. But for example, many therapists won't take insurance or will offer a sliding scale fee. If you're an employee at a group private practice or somewhere else, you can't really make those decisions because your employer has already made those decisions for you. So when you're self employed, you can say, I think it's unethical to take insurance, therefore I'm only doing a cash pay practice. Many therapists actually do that, and I'll get to that in a minute. As a solo practitioner, you'll be able to market yourself fairly. This is a huge one for me. I never felt like I was represented appropriately, fairly, or accurately working at a group practice or anywhere else. And so being self employed really is ideal for me because I'm the only one who really understands what it is that I do and what my training actually is. Group practices may not represent you very well, so being self employed means you can set your own brand and tell the public more accurately about your training and your niche. You can also cater your advertisements to more of your target audience and consequently get the clients that you actually want to see, which overall reduces burnout and increases overall career satisfaction. Being a therapist can be lonely in most settings. And that is the sad truth of being a therapist. You are often behind closed doors unless you're like in a staff meeting or something, so you won't get to know your colleagues very well, as you often just see each other in passing and then you go to your offices and closed doors and you're with clients the rest of the time. So keep that in mind if collaborating with your colleagues, making friends at work is very important to you, then being a therapist might not actually be the most ideal profession because it can be a very lonely profession, especially because most therapists are self employed and work as a solo practitioner. Most employers require you to give every single client or patient a diagnostic label. Due to labeling theory, which is a sociology thing, this can be unethical because it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy and further exacerbate a patient's symptoms. So I am really against diagnosing, but unfortunately it is considered a best practice in our profession, and it is required by insurance, just like with case notes, to prove medical necessities so they are willing to pay for services. Insurance companies sometimes claw back the money they paid you for therapy that you offered because they didn't like your notes or for no apparent reason at all. Sometimes they just take the money back and you just don't get paid. So, along those lines, sometimes insurance companies, if they're not clawing it back, sometimes they don't even pay for services in the first place. So, again, they're leaving you unpaid for honest work. And because of those issues, in addition to all the time that it takes to deal with insurance companies, that's why a lot of therapists don't take insurance, because it really is a headache. And in some cases, especially for the clinician, it can be unethical to take insurance. Insurance companies require that you are in session for at least 53 minutes for you to bill a 60-minute session. Now, when I say that, like superficially, that sounds pretty reasonable, but when you think about it, it might actually be unethical for the clinician. So, for example, I actually once had a client who was 25 minutes late, and I had them on my schedule. I was sitting in the office waiting for them the whole time. And so when I don't get paid for that full 60-minute session just because the client was late, it becomes unfair to me because I had them on the schedule and I was there on time. But insurance companies, they call that fraud if you try to bill a 60-minute session, even when it's not even your fault that the client was late or that the session wasn't at least 53 minutes. So that's another issue with insurance companies that raises ethical questions. And I know many practices have in their policy that if somebody shows up more than 15 minutes late, then it's too bad. You just have to pay a late cancellation fee and reschedule. So that probably is the best way to do it, since we can't bill insurance when somebody is as late as they are. Insurance companies require a lot more paperwork that you don't get paid for compared to just having a cash practice. So here is yet another reason insurance companies are just plain unethical in the way they do business. Therapists do not make very much money in the first place. And when you're spending all of your extra time calling the insurance companies, submitting insurance claims, filling out paperwork, and all that other stuff that they require, and you're not getting paid for that, that lessens your income even more. And so, once again, that's another reason why a lot of therapists will not take insurance, despite the fact that the public expects us to take insurance. So it's kind of a balance that we have to find, where like I'm recently starting to take insurance just for marketing reasons, but honestly it's kind of against my values. But you have to do what you have to do to get more people on your schedule so that you can pay your bills. It's a fine line. In a private practice setting, you don't usually get benefits, and this is because you're kind of hired like a contractor, but in most cases you're still a W-2 employee at the same time. It's really weird. So typically you are paid like a contractor in that you are getting paid on a per session basis. This can feel really unfair when your colleagues get more sessions than you do and get a higher income than you do when you have more experience and training than they have. So that has been the case for me many times because I'm a male therapist, and quite often most of the therapists that you work with are going to be female, and they have fuller schedules and therefore have a higher income than you. And so that might still be the case if you're a female, like for whatever reason you just don't have as full of a schedule as the other female therapists, and that can feel really unfair. So just a heads up on that. You often have to share an office with other clinicians in a group practice. This is especially if you don't have a full schedule. And that can feel really unfair when you have complete intentions of working full time, but your employer just isn't giving you more clients. I have been in that situation many, many times. In fact, two of the group practices that I worked at kept hiring interns and supervised clinicians when I still didn't even have a full schedule. And to me, that was an ethical violation where the employer was doing something unethical to me when they knew that I wanted more clients, and yet they hired more clinicians anyway, regardless of my need to fill my schedule more. So if you ever become a group practice owner, please make sure that your clinicians have full schedules and they're happy with their schedules before you hire more clinicians. Because the more clinicians you hire, the emptier everybody's schedules are going to be. There are only so many clients to go around. Another thing is, I mentioned how having to share an office with other clinicians. It does make sense if you were a business owner, you had several employees, and you only had a few offices. Naturally, you're going to want them to share. But there's an issue with that for those employees who have to share, because even though we don't always have appointments filling our whole schedule, sometimes we need that private space to be doing our case notes and to be doing other things that the employer wants the employee to actually be doing. There was actually one time at a group practice that I worked at where all the offices were filled, including the one that I was used to using. I didn't have any appointments, but I had to sit out in the hallway on the floor to write my case notes because I didn't want to do it at home because I had children at home. I knew I didn't have privacy. So if you ever want to become a group practice owner, make sure that your employees, your therapists, have a private office as much as you can possibly provide that, Or if they have to share, make sure they have ample time to do their case notes before they get kicked out of the room when the next therapist comes in. Group practice owners will often advertise how much you could make in a perfect world when they create job postings, but realistically, you'll never make that much. So, quite often, I see this a lot on Indeed. You look for job postings for a mental health therapist, counselor, social worker, whatever it may be, and they'll say, oh, yeah, you can make $120,000 a year. But then you do the interview and you find out, oh, I only get paid per session, and it's like $50 per session or $40 per session in some cases. And not only that, but once you start working there, it takes a very long time to get a full schedule, if you ever get a full schedule at all. And you realize $120,000 a year, that's unrealistic. I would have to work full time, Monday through Friday, with back to back appointments, a 100% full schedule to make that much money in a year. So it's on the group practice owner for false advertising. I would call that an ethical issue, but quite often they will advertise what you could make in a perfect world. And I just want you to know you're not going to make that much. The average income for therapists, at least before the pandemic, was about $40,000 a year. It is now, I'm not sure what the official statistics are, but I would guess that it's closer to $50,000 or $55,000 a year, which still isn't very much. It's pretty much on par with an elementary school teacher who only has a bachelor's degree. So, considering the type of work that we do, I think we really deserve to make more money, and we just don't, because everybody complains that therapy is too expensive. And not only that, but insurance companies don't pay us very much, and I think they should. I think they should pay us closer to what doctors get paid, considering the training that we go through and what we do for our work. Okay, so enough about private practices. I want to talk about residential settings. There are different types of residential settings that you could work in as a therapist. There's wilderness therapy, which is really popular in the state of Utah, and from what I hear, not as popular anywhere else, and I think that has to just do with state laws that we have. There's eating disorder centers, there's troubled teens centers, and there's hospital behavioral units. These are all residential settings where, unfortunately, most people don't really want to be in these settings when they have to go get this residential treatment. And so if you are a therapist in one of these settings, most likely it's going to be a very high stress, high burnout kind of a situation, which also means a high turnover. So they might pay you close to $100,000 a year to work in like an eating disorder facility, for example. But there's a reason that they're offering you more money, and that's because most therapists simply don't want to stay in such a high stress environment and work with such difficult cases. Now, the good news is you are only with clients some of the time, but you are doing paperwork and making phone calls pretty much the rest of the time, including doing family therapy with parents over the phone or maybe with on a video call. So it doesn't mean that you're not doing therapy when you're not seeing clients, because quite often you're collaborating with parents and other practitioners. You are still doing a lot of work even when you're just sitting in the office. Quite often, residential settings involve the most severe cases of mental illness. Most patients don't want to be there, like I said. That makes it a lot more difficult. And so if you don't really want to work with schizophrenia, severe suicidal ideation, or bipolar disorder, or some other type of psychosis, most likely a residential setting isn't for you. Now, also, another thing worth noting is if you don't like collaborating with parents or other family members, like I personally don't, I'd rather just work one-on-one directly with the patient and that's it, then a residential setting might also not be for you. Now, it is more income, like I said, if you can handle sticking around. Some people really thrive in this kind of a setting. And if that's the case for you, then more power to you. You will get paid more, but it is higher stress. So hopefully you can handle it. Another setting that I think is noteworthy that therapists might work in is an education setting. So, university counseling centers, I actually did that myself a couple years ago, and it was pretty nice. There are some drawbacks though. So, it is very politically oriented because it is a university, and psychology, just in general, is has always been politically oriented, and so that can really cause a lot of stress if you are politically conservative, for example, which honestly, I think that's kind of an unethical thing to make a workplace so politically oriented that it makes employees feel uncomfortable and sometimes even traumatized. So, in my opinion, they really should make these settings more politically neutral. But in universities, they don't usually make things politically neutral, unfortunately. Now, the good news is in a university setting, you don't have to do any billing, it's just outpatient therapy. You do have to diagnose, and there are strict policies that you have to follow, unfortunately. In a university setting, because you are a healthcare provider and working in an education setting, you have to abide by FERPA and HIPAA. So these are just privacy laws in the United States. As long as you are generally following very good confidentiality practices, you shouldn't have to worry so much about FERPA, even if you're not terribly familiar with it. But in most cases, they're going to make you do trainings on that anyway to help you be more familiar with it. But that is a consideration. You have to follow more regulations when you're working at a university. The same might be true for school counseling. I'm not personally a school counselor, at least with the K through 12 level. You might still have to abide by HIPAA. For certain, you have to abide by FERPA. Again, there's no billing in that setting. It's outpatient therapy. However, you do coordinate a lot more with parents and teachers when you're working in kindergarten through 12th grade school counseling. And you're probably going to do a lot more with like IOPs, or not IOPs, IEPs, individualized education plans, which means that you're going to be collaborating with other therapists, you're going to be meeting with teachers and parents and principals, maybe other healthcare providers on just different plans for specific students, and that can be very time consuming from what I hear. This is another setting where strict policies are enforced. So if you don't like following a lot of rules, maybe this isn't the best setting for you. However, if you don't mind following a lot of rules and you like working with children, maybe this is a good setting for you. One major perk to being a school counselor, and sometimes a university counselor or therapist, is that you get paid time off for school breaks. So there are definitely drawbacks to working in a school setting because of all the policies and legal ramifications that come with that. But you get more ample paid time off, and so maybe that's worth the trade-off. Now, the last setting that I'd like to talk about, I mentioned public mental health clinics. So quite often, these are nonprofit organizations. They're running by grants or they're being funded by Medicare, Medicaid. They are publicly funded institutions. And these are the institutions which, ironically, there aren't very many of them. Chances are there's one in your community. There's usually one in every major city, at least. But ironically, when you go to graduate school, they are most likely going to cater your education to working at a facility like this one. They expect you to essentially work for the state or work for the government, to take Medicaid, to take Medicare, which I think is more appealing to social workers, because social workers are more into focusing on underprivileged populations, especially those who live in poverty, those who might be a person of color, for example. You're going to deal more with substance abuse counseling in this kind of a setting. And so social workers seem to be more interested in that than the rest of us. But this is definitely an option if you want more of a salaried position. So this is a guaranteed full-time income with benefits. From what I hear, they don't pay very well, but it is a full-time income, so that's nice, regardless of the number of sessions that you have. However, it is Monday through Friday. It is 8 hours a day, and I was specifically taught in graduate school that if you have 30 sessions per week, that is considered full time. I have never reached 30 sessions per week since I became a therapist. Even at like 15 or 20, I feel like I'm kind of burning out and it feels like full time for me. Now, in a public setting, a public clinic, they really want you to schedule more like 30 sessions per week. So if you think about how I was describing what it was like to market yourself so that you can get your ideal clients to reduce burnout. If you are in a public setting, you're taking Medicare, Medicaid, which essentially means you are getting pretty severe cases, people who are impoverished, people who are not very well off, you are going to end up with some very, very difficult clients to work with, and that's going to burn you out so much faster. The good news with working in a public mental health clinic is kind of depends on where you are, but if you work in what's called a high need area, you possibly could get student loan forgiveness right off the bat. You do have to commit to a couple of years of full-time work. If you quit before that time is up, then they'll make you pay that money back. So you could end up in debt. But as long as you live out those 2 years and you stay there full time for that time frame, then you get to keep that money. Last I heard, they'll give you $50,000 toward your student loans, which is a pretty good amount. I think most people these days probably spend more than that on graduate school, but at least it'll cover most of it. So that might be an option for you if you end up with student loans and you are struggling to pay them back. I think especially if you're a male therapist, you're probably struggling to pay back your loans. So working in a public clinic could be more appealing just for that reason of getting your loans wiped out. Just like with working in a university or a school setting, this is going to be a highly I want to say political, but they're going to have very strict policies in place because it's publicly funded. Working with Medicaid, I have done that myself before. I have not taken Medicare before, but I have taken Medicaid, which generally is for people who are impoverished, where Medicare is for the elderly who are impoverished. So with Medicaid, in my experience, there is a lot more paperwork as far as that goes, a lot more documentation. Your case notes are a lot crazier than where you would write your case notes anywhere else, even when you're billing private insurance. So Medicaid just requires a lot more boxes to check before they will pay you. And if you ever work in a private practice setting and you are taking something like Medicaid or Medicare, like I said, there's a lot of documentation. And I did mention private insurance, they don't pay very much for therapy. Well, Medicaid and Medicare pay even less. It's really not very much money that you get paid per session from these public insurances. So just keep that in mind. So you do have the possibility of loan forgiveness. You have the possibility of a full-time salary and benefits working in a public clinic. But the work itself is, from what I hear, it's very unpleasant. Technically, I have worked in that setting before, but it was just for a few months. It was just for a practicum while I was in graduate school. So I can't speak to like the long term as far as like what the experience is with that working over a course of years. But from what I hear, they don't pay very much, even though it is a benefited position and the possibility of getting loan forgiveness. To wrap up this episode, I know we're really kind of making this a little bit long this time for a bonus episode, but you don't have to just do therapy as a therapist. Quite often, therapists will do consulting work. So, big companies might hire you to actually do mental health consulting on behalf of their employees to make it a more mentally healthy workplace. Or you could write books, same thing. Maybe it's about workplaces, maybe it's about a specific condition like depression or bipolar. You can write a book about anything you want, really. You could do podcasting like I do. It's not very common. It is very time consuming, but that is one thing that you could do as a therapist. And another one is coaching. The nice thing about coaching is it's not as regulated across the United States, so that allows you to practice outside of your state. Now, that is something that I did not mention. When you are a therapist, you are legally confined to the rules that your state puts on you for that license that you have. So in pretty much 100% of cases, I haven't heard otherwise yet, but if you have a state license, you are legally required to only practice within that state where your license is. So I'm in the state of Utah. I am licensed in Utah, which means I can only see people when they are physically in Utah during our session, even if I'm seeing them online. Does that mean like if they're 6 hours away but they're still in Utah, I can see them? Yes, I can. But as soon as they go over the border to Arizona or Nevada or Colorado or Idaho or Wyoming, suddenly it becomes illegal for me to see them, and I have to say, sorry, you have to see a therapist in whatever state you're in, or wait until you get back to schedule another session. So that is a drawback of being a therapist. With everything going online these days, a lot of people are expecting to do therapy online, and sometimes I still get calls from people out of state expecting me to do therapy with them online, and I just say, sorry, I can't do that. It's not legal. But with coaching, I can do that. Coaching is a lot lighter. It takes less training. It's not exactly therapy. I can still make it mental health oriented, and a lot of therapists who do coaching, they will do that. They'll do mental health coaching so that they can see people across state lines. Now, we can't typically take insurance for coaching. I think there is a new law that allows us to bill insurance for coaching, but it requires a certain setup. It requires certain training to know how to do that and to make sure that we're getting reimbursed for that. Most likely, because life coaching takes less training, it also isn't paid for as handsomely as insurance. Now, maybe handsomely isn't the right word because they don't pay very much for therapy in the first place, but I would guess that they pay even less for coaching. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you are thinking about becoming a therapist, drop some comments on Spotify or some other platform. Depending on where you listen, you might find a comment spot, you might not. But I'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, or maybe you're a therapist and you have a different experience with what it's like to be a therapist. Go ahead and send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. I generally was disappointed with my experience becoming a therapist because it's not what I thought it was. There's a whole lot of clinical jargon that's thrown around, even at continuing education trainings and in staff meetings. Like they throw around these highly specialized concepts that I know what they're talking about, and I've done training in them, but honestly, it really turns me off when I hear this. Sometimes people call it psychobabble. I'm really turned off when I hear that kind of stuff. Like, I would rather just be a human being and try to be myself rather than being this robotic professional who uses complex terminology that really doesn't matter. So, I mean, that's one of the many disappointments that I had in becoming a therapist. Insurance is another one. Having to diagnose is another one. And the main one, like I mentioned before, is finding out that men really struggle in this profession. When I went to graduate school, I really thought that I would at least be financially secure, but I still, after many years of being a therapist, I still have yet to be financially secure. So that is a major consideration if you are a male and you're considering becoming a therapist. Hey, now I want to reward you for listening all the way to the end of the episode. This is the end, except I've got a treat for you. So I put out a simple survey on a Facebook group of hundreds of therapists in my area to ask for their opinion on this topic of what it's like to be a therapist. So I'm just going to rapid fire some of their responses off. Some of them are things that I've already mentioned, but that just reiterates the importance of being aware of these. So here's what they said. There's no business instruction in graduate school, and if you work in a private practice setting, there are no benefits. I didn't think to mention that earlier. There are no benefits in a private practice setting most of the time. So that means no health insurance, no paid time off, no retirement. So make sure you are prepared to get those things on your own. Another person said how to discuss self-care with clients is different in an academic setting versus how to help clients actually carry it out in real life. Another person said the importance of working on your own mental health. It's too easy to take on clients' problems as your own. I think this is especially true if you're an empath. And they said also setting boundaries with coworkers, clients, the job, and actual family. Yes, that is totally true. I had an employer that was not very good with professional boundaries. She would text me and email me on the weekends and at nights, and I felt like that was kind of an invasion of my privacy. So be aware that that is an issue. You'll have to set boundaries and be very assertive about those things for your own self-care. Continuing education is the best for educating yourself, and I think that's a given because it's legally required. But this person also said something that is pretty helpful. She said, focus on one modality at a time, learn it well, and move on. And also be a mentor to others and share the wealth of knowledge. That's really good advice. I think a lot of therapists will learn a lot of things all at the same time. And so that really kind of sets them up to be a jack of all trades, master of none, kind of a therapist. So if you can focus on one thing at a time and become an expert at it, you're going to be a lot better. Another person said, something I didn't anticipate is that it can be a lonely job. I mentioned that before. You can't go home and talk about your day in detail with your family. Yes, we are legally required to abide by HIPAA, which means we have strict confidentiality laws that we have to follow, which means we can't go and discuss our cases in detail with anybody except our supervisors and maybe our coworkers. If they are working in the same business, we can legally share those things. But if they are not in the same business, we have to keep our mouths closed. So be aware of that. Another person said a pleasant surprise is that my social skills have improved a lot. I think that's definitely true. Most therapists are introverts. We have immature social skills, and so when we become a therapist, we talk to a lot more people, even though most of the time it's just one-on-one, and that really helps our social skills. So that's a good thing to be aware of. A misconception is that we have it all together because we're therapists. So this person essentially is saying people expect us to have perfect mental health because we're therapists, but just like how doctors don't have perfect health and nutritionists don't have a perfect diet, therapists don't have perfect mental health. And so just keep in mind, we are people with jobs just like you, just like everybody else. And so we're not perfect, but we are still experts because we are continually studying and practicing mental health. Another person said, I found it really important to make friends with my cohort in graduate school and to study together with those friends. The support that I received was invaluable. Also, when I started to work as an actual therapist, I look back now and I think I did not know what I was doing. Another person said a big thing I was not prepared for was the client load in private practice. I naively thought I could step into it and have as many clients as I wanted and needed, and that just hasn't been the case. Part of it might be the oversaturation of the area, because we are in a university town, but it would have been nice for anyone to warn me that it can take a while to get up and running. So yeah, I think even if you are a female, it might take quite a lot of work to fill your schedule, and so that could be super disappointing in a private practice setting. Another person said, not every program is a clinical track. I didn't know this myself until this person made this comment. Apparently, this person signed up for a Master of Social Work program, not realizing that it was a generalist track instead of a clinical track. So I think this might be the case more so for social work and possibly psychology, where you might get a degree and it doesn't necessarily set you up to be a therapist. With counseling and marriage and family therapy, I think those are more likely to set you up to be a therapist because there's not really anything else you can do in those degrees. So make sure that when you're signing up for a graduate program that it actually is setting you up to be a therapist, especially once you graduate. Like you're getting all the required clinical hours that you need and everything that your license requires, or that your state requires for licensure. Another person said that not recognizing that not all supervisors are created equal is important. I had about 7 supervisors before I got independently licensed myself, and I can definitely speak to this. I had a couple supervisors that were just lousy, like they were lazy. I had one in particular that was actually really unsupportive of my career goals in getting into nutrition for mental health. A lot of it has to do with their background. Like this unsupportive supervisor that I had, she had like 25 years of experience in public mental health. So she was a stickler for the rules, very black and white with her thinking, not very innovative and not much of a business person. So she essentially was trying to train me as if I wanted to work in a public mental health setting, which ironically, it was in a private practice at the time. So some supervisors can be really unsupportive, really lazy with the way that they supervise, and some supervisors can just be awesome. I had a couple of supervisors that I just loved. They were so supportive. They were encouraging of my creative ideas in trying to be a different therapist. And so sometimes it does mean quitting your job and getting another one to get a different supervisor, because a lot of it just has to do with where you work as to what kind of supervisor that you're going to get. Another person said, be prepared to be assertive for the experience and outcomes that you want in your career. Yes, totally true. A lot of that has to do with getting a good supervisor, and some of that has to do with company policies. Speak up for the policies or against the policies that you don't agree with. And some of that has to do with the training that you're going to get too. Sometimes your company is going to provide you with free training or discounted training that you don't necessarily want, but you take it because it's free or discounted. So speak up, make sure you're assertive, and speak up for the training that you actually want so that you can shape your career to be the way you want it to be for your ultimate career goals. And the last person said, going to graduate school does not teach you how to be a therapist. Get a good internship. Make sure, if you are able, shop around for a good internship. Sometimes you just have to take what you can get, but if you are able to shop around, get a good one. And that might also mean shopping around for a good supervisor. This person also says, be prepared to jump through lots of hoops and put your head down and just go for a long time before you can settle into a rhythm. So hopefully that was helpful. I think it's kind of nice to get some opinions from other therapists. Make sure you leave a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or otherwise send me a message if you have any other ideas. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review. That really helps me out. And also subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. Real Food Mental Health is for informational and entertainment purposes only. I do not necessarily agree with all of the views shared by guests. The information presented on this podcast is not intended to replace any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While I am a healthcare provider, I am not your provider. Always seek the advice of an appropriate healthcare practitioner with any personal questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you've heard on this podcast. Reliance on information provided by this podcast is at your own risk.